Yeah, the pleasure is completely on my side. Thanks for having me. And first of all, also thanks for organizing this conference. I think it's extremely important that we give room to things like that, where people can come together, the stakeholder groups that are involved in these developments come together and have room to, well, exchange ideas, but also bring themselves, let's say, always on track, touch base again in order to make sure that we as a community can drive things forward together. And as said, for me, it's really a big pleasure to take over the keynote, and I prepared a couple of slides. I like to stress that it's really a couple of slides because Peter was so kind to reminding me not to come up with a classroom presentation, but rather focus on a couple of important things that, as you said, Markus, might be able to set a little bit the scene for this conference today. And what I did was I prepared mainly 3 points. First of all, once more, and also perhaps also reflecting on what we learn together every day, like to talk a little bit about data ecosystems and data spaces. As we all know, I mean, this is a developing market, and as mentioned, I think we learn every day, and I think it's always important to share these experiences and insights in order to make sure that developments like the EDC projects are contributing as best as we can to the requirements of data ecosystems and data space networks and owners. Also, in the second point, I would like to set this into a little bit the context of Gaia-X on the one hand side, but also IDS on the other, because both of these organizations are contributing to, let's say, paving the way with regard to understanding what we need, but also paving the way towards a, well, shared rules of the game, let's call it like that. And I think that's in order not to anticipate too much about this point, but I think this is the major beauty in associations like Gaia-X and IDS, that it's really, well, associations that are from the community for the community, right? So it's not dominated by one or a few players, and it's also not dictated by any government. It's places where the community, the industrial organizations, but also small and medium-sized companies come together and think about, okay, what is it what we really need, and how can we achieve this vision in the best possible way. And of course, while this is the beauty of these associations, there are a couple of things that can't be done, in my personal conviction, also within these associations, but that need to be done elsewhere, where we have the opportunity to bring things to life. And that's also why I'm so really happy to see the great development around the Eclipse Dataspace Connector, because this is one of the, if not the central or strategic endeavor towards implementing data sovereignty in a free and open software solution. Right. If we jump in with the first point, I would like to start with a couple of examples that I know that many of you are aware of, but which are always good to take as a reference to outline a little bit what data ecosystems are about. And I've seen that also a couple of colleagues from the Catena-X initiatives have dialed in. And for me, this is a perfect example for a data ecosystem, because it clearly conveys the idea that a community of stakeholders, collaborators, but also competitors on different levels of the supply chain come together to innovate together, to address requirements that they all share and that they can't respond to effectively on their own. And that's one of the fundamental characteristics, in my point of view, that ecosystems are basically multilateral forms of organizations where different stakeholder groups come together in order to contribute, in order to gain something. So it's not driven by hierarchical structures as we've seen them in many supply chains in the past. I don't want to touch only upon the automotive industry, but you can also look into, let's say, consumer goods, for example, where you have the same power plate structures, probably on different levels in the supply chain, but still they are there. And that is something that, in my true belief, has been understood, and which is also why Catena-X is existing, by the way, that well, the different players, the different members of the ecosystem across the different levels of an automotive supply chain need to team up and need to work in collaborative ways in order to, as mentioned, address requirements that are posed on all of them, and which, as mentioned, can't be, let's say, sufficiently and definitely not effectively be responded to by the individual players alone. And I took here a couple of these use cases. I mean, there is probably no other use case that is so urgently pressing as demand and capacity management. I think for those of you who are not so familiar with automotive supply chains, this is also, let's say, has gained really public attention through the shortage of semiconductor components, because it's clear that, I mean, as you know, that if you are an original equipment manufacturer, so a brand, a car maker brand like Volkswagen or BMW or Mercedes, then you have a relatively complex product, so a bill of material to manage across a relatively complex supply network. And that's in combination with the fact that you only produce 25% on the average of parts on your own. That tells you that, let's say, you need to team up in order to respond to, let's say, a foresight capacity and demand planning. But not only that, but also if we take seriously our ambition to circular economy goals, and also to our contribution to carbon neutrality, it is clear that no single player nor a single tier in the supply network possesses all the data that is needed in order to achieve this information transparency, in order to really achieve these goals. And therefore, it's, as I said, important to team up. Same thing holds true for if we look into, let's say, regulatory and legal compliance issues. Some of you might be aware of the fact that I think since last year, the so-called supply chain law is in place in Germany. And despite the fact that it was relaxed a little bit in contrast to the initial plans, so you're not forced to, let's say, create transparency about, let's say, that you really do not use child labor on any of the tiers in the supply chain, and you're, as far as I understand, at present not forced to guarantee this transparency until the last tier. But I'm also convinced that this will come. And how can you do that if you take the position of, let's say, a car manufacturer, if you are not, let's say, teaming up in terms of end-to-end data chains with your partners across the entire network? So it's crystal clear. And what I also like is the spirit in Catena-X, that there is really a movement to address these issues together, and to put aside a little bit the, let's say, well, also the culture, the cultural settings of the past, which dominated a little bit, let's say, standard setting over the last decades, but really sit together and build something new together. So, and of course, there are a couple of, let's say, design principles that hold true. For example, user-friendly environment for collaborative use of end-to-end data chains. So it must be easy, because it's all really not making a difference if we are not able to also include the majority of the players and members in the ecosystems. And the majority of those is, let's say, not the large corporates, the multinational corporates, but it's dominated by SMEs, and if Catena-X, as we as Catena-X, are not able to make an offering to them, which is easy to use with low entry barriers, then this is really a risk for the mission that we have. It must also be open and non-discriminatory. And that is also the reason why also Catena-X is strictly following a clear open source strategy. And also we envisage the fact that, let's say, data models, standards, but also components can be taken up by literally all players in the value chain. But still then, of course, we need to make sure the trust is ensured at all times, which brings us also to the need that, let's say, certification is necessary in order to make sure that members in the ecosystem can really trust that, let's say, the partner that pretends to be company XYZ is really actually that company is not, let's say, faking identities, for example. Yes, and of course we need to give Catena-X a home, which is also the reason why Catena-X has institutionalized itself as a non-for-profit association according to German law, but it's truly an international initiative. Why? Well, because I mean, these not only the value chain, but also the end-to-end data chains do not stop at country borders. And I should say at this point that we see that also in many of the use cases when we talk about data spaces and data ecosystems, that in contrast to the past, where we usually had, let's say, teams consisting of, let's say, business people on the one hand side, so analysts and business architects and technical experts and developers on the other hand, we see, let's say, these teams are now extended by legal expertise. Why? Because we see definitely an increasing number of regulation when it comes to data sharing and data protection in the different economic areas in the world, which will also bring me to a fundamental requirement that we address with the EDC development, which is making sure that we have a technology in place that allows us easier than in the past to translate legal provisions, so basically verbal text, into running code. This is needed because otherwise we will altogether drown in, let's say, bureaucracy and administrative burdens that are posed on us through the increasing number of regulation. A second example is the mobility data space. To me, this is also a very good example because it shows nicely that a data ecosystem does not reuse, let's say, the organizational forms that we have been having in the past, because the community around the mobility data space is embracing literally all the various stakeholder groups. And I should say that mobility in this sense is really a reference case because it comprises, let's say, the B2B side, but also, let's say, the B2C side. So because in the end, we all are using cool mobility services, but also, let's say, the public sector, like municipalities, the cities, but also governments. And therefore, in my personal point of view, this is one of the perfect cases in order to show that data ecosystems bring together various kinds of players, of actors, and also that, let's say, true innovation is only possible if you are able, through a data space, to combine various types of data from these various types of sources, like private data from companies, from businesses, which need to be combined with, let's say, the data from other businesses, but also from, let's say, consumer-generated data. So where am I? So where are, let's say, the passenger flows, for example, but also context information like traffic jams, weather, road conditions, all these kind of things. And the latter category is usually, or often, let's say, coming from open data sources. So that is also one of the fundamental patterns that we see in data spaces, that innovation in almost all cases requires that you are able as a community to make these different types of data from different sources available according to the rules that the data provider is able to determine, and then easily allow integration and combination and in the end analysis of this data while protecting the usage constraints that are put on the data by the data provider. And in the end, I mean, what we try to achieve with data spaces is to come up with a place where this can happen, to put it into very simple terms. In order to do that, we need a couple of, let's say, software functionalities to be put into place, which are depicted here on this, let's say, platform-like view graph in the middle. For example, identity and access management need to be put into place. We need to have a metadata directory, basically a catalog where you can look, okay, I need to have available for my use case, I don't know, all the free parking lots in the city of Wolfsburg, for example, and then I can basically search this directory, which data provider is offering this piece of data. We also need to have vocabularies in place in order to make sure that all of the various stakeholder groups achieve an unambiguous understanding of, well, the business object meaning, let's call it like that. And that, as we all know, that is easier said than done. Coming back to Catena-X and demand and capacity management, from my experience, it's often not so clear to achieve a common understanding what actually a capacity is, because it could be a block capacity, could be a free capacity. It has a time relation because you always want to know when a capacity is available to a certain point in time. So it's always, simple things are in the end not that easy, but I think that is something that we can address also through collaborative forms. And that is also one of the, let's say, major tasks that an ecosystem must do to come up with a shared vocabulary. Yeah, and as I said, I mean, this is something that happens not only in mobility and automotive, but we see that all over the place. I mean, which is also probably why, let's say, in Europe, but also in other places of the world, like in China, but also in the US, I mean, all of these economic areas came up with their data strategy. And there you can hardly find any limitation with regard to certain sectors or domains. So, which is good, because that's, let's say, one of the success factors for adoption of an infrastructure. And in the end, we talk about a data sharing infrastructure, that there is, let's say, a big market for use of this infrastructure. And we see that this need, as I said, across all the different sectors. In the end, an ecosystem, as mentioned earlier on, is, in my point of view, a multilateral form of organizing for joint customer innovation. And that's different as we understand, for example, value networks, which are mainly driven by a dominance of some sort. And also there is, let's say, a balance of the viability of the ecosystem as a whole. So this needs to be running smoothly, let's call it like that, but also of the business model of its individual members. And that is also the reason why we took this notion of ecosystems from biology in the first place, because there we have this equilibrium that can be reached when, let's say, the individual organisms in that case are finding a proper habitat and way to live, let's call it like that. And also it depends on the fact that everybody has to give something in order to take something. And that is something that we also see in this data ecosystems in the business realm. Yes, of course, this is all part of as we all know, of a overarching discussion around digital sovereignty. And I took this view graph, which was created last year by Akatech, and was, yeah, the main editor was Henning Kagermann, who was has long been a president of Architect, and by the way, also in his former professional life, also the CEO of SAP, as you may know. And yeah, he is obviously a big supporter of architectural thinking, which I also am, and trying to basically, decouple a little bit complex systems into architectural layers. And you can clearly see that European Dataspaces, or Dataspace in general, are an integral part. And what we can also see is that they rest on a platform where data sharing actually takes place. And these platforms, again, then consist of software components, which you can see here on level 3. And so this basically is, let's say, in the context of the overall discussion of digital sovereignty, where we can position or locate our playing ground. I should also say that if we drill deeper into these 3 layers of this overall stack, we can distinguish, let's say, an ecosystem layer where actually business innovation happens, and where we can also observe the emergence of individual business models, in particular driven by smaller companies, by startups, which is what we want and what we want to foster and facilitate. And personally, I also think that, let's say, no state or government, or also not a non-for-profit association should interfere with that. We should make sure that, let's say, in these mobility ecosystems, these little endeavors, these startups, and the cool new ideas that make all our lives easier can flourish. But all of them need, let's say, a place where, let's say, data can be shared in a fair manner. And this is basically the second layer, which we can then call a data space layer, where we need to achieve, as mentioned earlier, unambiguous understanding of the business, but also of the data objects that we use. And we need to make sure that we share the data together with, let's say, the terms and conditions that the data provider attaches to the data, in order to make sure that the data is not used against his interest. And what we see is that, let's say, in order to make this happen, also organizations are created which usually do not follow a pure profit maximizing strategy. They usually have an intermediary business model, which is often, let's say, reminding us on, let's say, relatively, I don't want to call them agent, but let's say old school legal entity or legal forms, like, for example, cooperative societies. And that's interesting. But on the other hand, it's also clear, because, I mean, if a data ecosystem really is a multilateral forum for a certain community and addresses needs that everybody is let's say, confronted with, it's of course clear that people team up, right, and try to share this burden and try to create something where they can come together. And this is also why, and I will come to this later again, the mobility data space is institutionalized as a non-for-profit limited liability company in Germany, and that's interesting. Yes, and beneath this, let's say, this logical or business layer of a data space, we, of course, in the end, it's software which we talk about, because data need to be stored somewhere, need to be accessed through an API, need to be transformed, mapped, analyzed, shared. And we need to respond to questions, okay, what kind of software do we need for that? And on which kind of platforms does this software components, do these software components run? And there we are usually in a typical infrastructure business model. I don't want to talk too much about, let's say, data space as a conceptual term. Just very briefly, you may all know that this notion of a data space was initially presented, I believe, 15 years ago or so, in a research paper of, I guess, 3 guys, which mainly came from the linked data research community. And as you all know, linked data has a history in semantic technologies and, let's say, making the web, let's call it like that, more searchable and semantically operational, if I may call it like that. And also in linked data, as the name also says, the idea was embraced not to put everything into one big pot, but rather leave the data where it is and then connect the different dots on a semantic level, which is also good because it means that we are not required to force all the data into one schema, which doesn't make sense on a larger scale, and which also allows, let's say redundancies, which are, let's say, often also desired in practical use cases. And it also, and that's interesting, it also allows overlaps of ecosystems, and this is also something we will come to later. So when the IDS initiative started, we thought, well, that's probably a good idea for creating these data sharing environments, but also already then there was this demand for, okay, how can we make sure that this is, let's say, only happening between trusted participants? And also, how can we make sure that the individual data provider has a say in determining what should happen with that data? And that was, let's say, also a little bit the time where this notion of data sovereignty has coined in this context. I should also say, and that is something that you also may know, that data sovereignty has a history in, let's say, something that we would nowadays probably refer to as cloud sovereignty. So from a geographical standpoint, where is the data stored, and does a nation, for example, can call itself sovereign in the way where their data is stored and treated? And so we took it, let's say, from that understanding and transferred this conceptual notion of data sovereignty to the B2B realm. When talking about trusted participants, and if you remember what I said, that there are in these data ecosystems patterns that you always are required to combine private data with open data from, let's say, public sources. It is also clear that we are, let's say, asked, required, confronted to combine this data space idea and the idea of data sovereignty with the huge initiatives that have been running for years around open data, scientific and research data, where, as you know, these FAIR principles apply. So it needs to be findable, interoperable, accessible, reliable, these kind of things. And I think that's important, that we all together make sure that, well, we do not, let's say, emphasize this misunderstanding. These are two totally disconnected domains. So private data on the one hand side, and open data according to FAIR principles on the others, that don't have anything to do with it. Because the opposite is true, right? I mean, we need to bring this together. And this is also interesting because, I mean, as I said, the fundamental design principles of the B2B data spaces is mainly, control in the sense of data sovereignty, while in the research and scientific community, openness is the key design principle. I think it's not, let's say, it's definitely possible to bring this together. But that's what we have to keep in mind and should do. Since then, this notion of data spaces has evolved, as always with any kind of, let's say, also buzzwords, let's call it like that. And now we can understand the notion also from a business perspective, as mentioned, because it's, a data space is a form of collaboration on data, because, as mentioned, the mobility data space, it is a legal entity, right? So obviously it has institutionalized itself. And also data spaces in that understanding, so as a legal actor, are subject to well, legal and regulatory provisions. So it's also a data space, is also object of regulation. In particular, the Data Governance Act has to be mentioned here because that specifies what you should do if you want to set up a data sharing business. And in particular, it tells you that if you do that, let's say, not only for the pure sharing purpose, but also try to use the data that you want to share also for other purposes, for your own other purposes, then you are basically forced to separate this business into a separate legal entity. That is, for those of you who are interested in that, look into Article 11, which is relatively explicit with regard to that. But I come to that later. Well, in the end, to illustrate once more the fundamental design of these kind of data spaces, it brings together different participants that are eager to engage in data sharing for various reasons, as mentioned earlier. Right now, and that brings us also to the EDC connector development. In order to connect yourself with a data space, apparently you need a connector, some sort of gateway, which provides an API, which allows you to collaborate on data with others, and also with, let's say, a couple of, in IDS we call them essential services. In Gaia, it's referred to as the federation services, which make sure that, let's say, interoperability and, let's say, also trust is in place. However, which also makes sure that, let's say, the entire system can go without a central data store, which is important, as I mentioned in the beginning. Yes, and I think this basically is a very high level, of course, view graph. But I should also say that it's and that is something that we should all together work on. That in particular for people that have not a long history in data architectures and database design, it's not so easy to really understand, buy in, comprehend the notion of federated systems. And that is something which we, in my personal point of view, need to do all together to, in easy terms, convey this message. I think, and I don't want to go through all the details, I think on the left-hand side, it's pretty clear because we've been involved over the last, I don't know, 5 years or so with requirements from data space communities, what the requirements are. So they address the entire ecosystem, so it must be in general open, but we want to trust partners and stuff like that. On data, we need to be able to articulate these terms and conditions for the data economy, so that the usage constraints, or even if it's not constraints, the conditions under which the data can be used by third party. We also need to put into place some sort of traceability for data flows or data provenance, and also heterogeneity in terms of schemas need to be supported, as mentioned earlier. And with regard to the platforms, we should not reinvent the wheel. That is something which I always find important, but should, for the sake of scaling and also time to value, use as much as we can existing standards. And those are, let's say, horizontal standards. And we will see that also today when we talk about, let's say, also standards to articulate rules, to define policies, for example, but also, let's say, API standards. But on top of that, in the different domains, we also have domain-specific standards. Like in the industrial domain, for example, there is OPC UA, we have AutoML, and we have also very prominently, of course, the asset administration shell, which allows us to represent digital twin data of industrial assets. Well, that is relatively clear, and as I see it, we talk about, let's say, the nitty-gritty details still, which is fair enough. But what is to a certain extent way more open is, let's say, overall economical and governance implications. So how can we ensure long-term funding for these kind of infrastructure things? Should that be done completely by the private sector, or is it like the motorway system in Germany that is basically carried by the state and also in fact also operated by a state-owned company? In general, how do data space ownership and operations look like? Very, very important. What about incentive systems? Could we utilize, for example, these principles of decentralized autonomous organizations for achieving this goal, which is a perfect fit, if you ask me? And also, how can we make sure that governance for the data economy is in place? As I said, this is always seen in context of Gaia-X and IDS. For sure, I don't want to repeat, let's say, all the, architectural details, but walk you a little bit through a couple of things that put it a little bit into a broader context. So IDS and Gaia-X pursue similar goals. I mean, IDS was created to respond to this question, well, how to keep ensure data sovereignty when sharing data. And similar in Gaia-X, how to keep and ensure data sovereignty over data and services also in the cloud. So it's similar, but overlapping. Both are non-for-profit organizations, both have lots of members. The data space scope of IDS was and also still is mainly for within data spaces. So I have this community and I want to define all the components that are needed to share data in a sovereign fashion within this data space. While Gaia-X has taken up the idea, oh, wait a minute, I mean, people are not only part of one data space, how can we make sure that data is shared across data space? Key deliverables will come to later. Both have an international focus. However, in Gaia-X, I mean, since it's basically also heavily supported by governments, of course, there's this, let's say, this strong European flavor, let's call it like that. Both are similar because it's a federated design and key architecture elements differ a bit. I mean, we have this notion of the connector in IDS. And when we call in IDS essential services, something we call in Gaia-X federation services, so there's much overlap. And a couple of, let's say, different notions when it comes to identity management. There is, let's say, a not so federated and decentral approach right now in IDS as it is envisaged in Gaia-X. But I should say that, let's say, also in the next release of the reference architecture model, this will change and more decentralized approaches will be adopted. As mentioned, both pursue the same goals and should be concerned with coming up mainly 3 result types. So first of all, I think personally also, I think it's always necessary to describe how these kind of things can work. So you need to have an architecture document on a conceptual level, which basically brings all the different stakeholders in the community on the same page and also creates an unambiguous understanding of what we want to do. And that's also why I'm very happy that since a year or so, we have it also in Gaia-X with this conceptual model. However, also it's nice to read something, but better is running code. Therefore, these associations should take care. They should not do it on their own, to be clear on that. Not at least not everything which is needed by themselves. But we need to have open source software implementations in order to scale the idea, to speed up adoption, and also to, frankly, to learn what works and what doesn't. And we need some sort of certification in place. From my personal point of view, this is the point where we have, let's say, most of the open discussions still. And but it's needed because if we, let's say, allow everybody to take it up and we want to have trust, I think we need to have something which we can rely on, some sort of trust on. And the biggest challenge is to keep all these three angles of this triangle in sync, right? Because this is what we need to, the point where we have to come to in order to, let's say, make use of the advantages of DevOps, for example. Also, we see, let's say, an evolution of these kind of data sharing ecosystems, and I'd like to stress the view graph on the right-hand side, because if I look into companies like BASF, for example, they are part of Catena-X because they produce coatings for, let's say, the coatings of the chassis, for example. But this is only one of their business units. They do lots of other things, and which basically contribute even more to the overall revenue of this particular company. And so they are, what I want to say is they are part of multiple data spaces. And what we need to make sure is that, let's say, from a company like BASF, we do not end up in a situation where you have incompatible identity management technologies, incompatible self-description schemes for data sources, and so on and so forth in place, because that would create silos and not overlapping data spaces. So the interesting question now is, let's say, how does these federators, which are depicted here in this lighter green color, what do they actually have to do within a data space and between data spaces? I mean, let's say the vision which we all follow is that we probably are not needing in the end, let's say, this one bubble that is outside there, the two data space ellipses, because we can create it in as decentralized fashion as possible. I think we may be able to reach this goal, while we will still have some, let's say, Highlander principles, so to say, perhaps in these associations, because the rules and the governance scheme and all these kind of things need to be located somewhere. But during runtime, we may end up with a totally decentralized picture, but probably not at the moment. I think this will be also an evolutionary path, and I think this is also something that we will touch upon in the course of this conference. So I need to speed up as I see. So I said that already. We need to make sure that these intermediaries or federators comply with, let's say, regulation, for example, the Data Governance Act. And what we want to need to make sure is that this happens as much as possible in an automated fashion, because we don't want to employ all the different lawyers to lengthy double check whether that is compliant or not. Not talking against lawyers, but we need to automate it as much as we can. And that is also something that should basically be always looked at as a source of requirements when we think about the EDC development. The good news is also that, let's say, these data associations teamed up, because from a user perspective, I don't want to end up in these lengthy discussions about what I should take from where and how this fits together, if at all, and if there is something which is better than the other. This is useless and doesn't bring us forward. We need to make sure that these kind of things are consistent and can be used as one stack eventually. And therefore, I think personally, for me, that was a big milestone that we have for the first time a written agreement about really working together, because prior to that, we also have these verbal agreements. Yes, we would do that and make sure, but this is nice, but it doesn't scale, of course, right? Yeah. Also, we shall utilize the hubs. It's not against, let's say, broadcasting our vision to these hubs. No, it's also about receiving feedback from them, because money is pouring into these kind of things. Data space communities and consortia are forming right now, and they are implementing stuff, and we need to make sure that we know about them in order to provide them with our, let's say, solutions and results, in particular the EDC development, to say, look, this is what you need. It's ready to run, just take it. And you will be able to achieve your project goals. Yeah, I took an example from Austria. I should say that I personally, but also Fraunhofer, we have a long years of history in working together in Dataspaces. There has been, I think, the start of these Austrian initiatives was called Data Market Austria, which has evolved somehow into the Austrian Data Intelligence Offensive, which bundles, let's say, the activities around creating data ecosystems in Austria. And I took this view graph with me because it's an excellent example how, let's say, on a national level, let's say the same message is conveyed, which makes life for all of us easier because it speeds up adoption, it speeds up time to market for the individual data space endeavors in that country. And most importantly, it makes sure that, let's say, this European vision of data spaces is achieved, because we do not start in Europe with, let's say, creating monolithic programs where the one and only mobility data space, to take this example, is created. No, we take a different approach because we see lots of bottom-up initiatives, which is great because they can control their own speed and, but we need to make sure that they fit together and that they are interoperable. And therefore, this initiative in Austria is great. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it's basically also aligned with all the relevant activities, in particular ours today, the Eclipse Dataspace Connector development. Talking about that one, so I think of course, the project page on the Eclipse Foundation website. Let me stress why I think it is important. So I mentioned that earlier on. So associations like Gaia-X and IDS is really great. And I truly say that because I'm part of that. Why? Because they represent a movement around data sovereignty. And the bigger the better, of course, and which is also great that Gaia-X has more than 300 members. But what can you achieve in such an environment? What you can achieve is consensus about the rules of the game, the governance, the standard setting, the common understanding where we want to go. But what is really not so easy to achieve in these kind of multi-stakeholder environments is basically really implementing stuff. And therefore, I think it's also important that we set these kind of things up in environments which business that is to support that, like the Eclipse Foundation. Also, I see a big opportunity for us as a community to create a true FOSS standard, because in the FOSS idea, trust is also embedded, my personal opinion. It is important to have all the stakeholder groups aboard, and I want to explicitly say that. It is an infrastructure. It is something that we do all together. And we have come up with rules of the game, with governance models and standards. But then under this umbrella, let's not fall into the trap of being discriminatory, but making sure that everybody has a voice in these FOSS developments, and let's bring the entire community together around this. Yes, and we need to do it now. This is also very important. Why? Because, well, I mentioned this. It's $1 billion market, or €1 billion market in Europe at least. And the money is poured into these initiatives. And if we do not offer them something that they can use, they will build it from scratch. They will reinvent the wheel. They will not come up with the best solution possible. So let's make sure that these kind of initiatives are aware of what we do. Let's be fast. Let's respond to their requirements to give them what they need. In my personal vision, I took the liberty to phrase it here. My vision is that in 10 years from now, perhaps earlier, nobody speaks about data sovereignty anymore. Why? Because it's just simply implemented everywhere. That is my vision. And with that, I'd like to stop here. Yeah, hope you found it somehow interesting, and hope you also found it useful for the ongoing discussions in this conference. And in my personal opinion, this is really a great opportunity that we all together have, and let's use it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Boris, for this interesting keynote. Basically, we have some minutes left for maybe questions. I saw one from David already in the chat. So if others have questions themselves, please feel free to add them in the chat, that we can maybe also answer them later on after the event happens. Basically, but Boris, so the question from David is about personal data. So can you elaborate a little bit? So you talked about Catena and mobility data space. So what about personal data? Is this also addressed?
Yes, I think also when I ended with my vision for, let's say, data sovereignty in the cloud, but also I have another vision. I want to have, let's say, also sovereignty of my personal data, over my personal digital twin, let's call it like that, because really I want to turn, well, the rules of the game around a little bit, because right now I'm the stupid guy who has to remember all the different username password combinations. I have literally no clue which service providers use what pieces of data from my digital twin and what happens when they transfer it to their service and what they do with that. So I would like to turn that around and allow and grant companies I trust usage rights on my data, which I can then also revoke. And one of these usage rights could be, yes, of course, you can do that, but only if you anonymize data or pseudonymize data, whatever. So I'm a big supporter of the idea that we also need to accelerate use of personal data, but of course, not by violating fundamental data protection rights of individuals. For me, that's also a continuum between maximum data use on the one hand side and maximum data protection on the other. I think that today the public debate is too much dominated by these extreme positions. And I think with technology, we can make sure that we, well, have viable solutions that considers the interest of the data users as well as the data providers in terms of anonymization and data protection, and therefore come up with better solutions that serve, as I said, the interest of the individual, but also the rightful interest of the community to make use of the data. We should not start with, let's say, what we could have done if we would have had this technology in place in the current corona pandemic, but this is, of course, still a good example. Hope that answers a bit this question.
Thanks. There's another question from Nadine. So Nadine asks for your definition of data sovereignty when it comes to data sharing.
Yeah, I think there is this. It's also nothing new. I mean, this. I think the translation would be self-determination about information has been around for a couple of years. And I like the idea of understanding data sovereignty as the capability of the data provider to be self-determined over their data resources, even when they are shared. You know, I mean, it's easy to be self-determined if you do not share the data, but just keep it for yourself. But that's not what we want. So I would like to extend this notion also to data sharing environments. But for me, it's a capability that is related to the data provider. And in order to, well, execute this capability, we need to provide the data providers with technical instruments, with software, to be able to do that. And that's what we do with the EDC connector, with the EDC project.
Mm-hmm. So any other questions? Like I said, so feel free to add them in the chat. 2 minutes left, so maybe I can raise a question, Boris, to fill the time. Basically, so we heard about the data spaces, and there are a lot of initiatives going on. This open source development of components happens. So if a company now wants to dive deeper into the topic of data spaces, so what would be the recommendation for the first step?
Yeah, I think, let's respond with what you should not do. I mean, it's always complicated in order, okay, I have a good idea, but I need data from other sources. And when you then say, okay, you have to form a non-for-profit company and you have to organize, let's say, I don't know, 15 stakeholder groups. My recommendation would be have this general principles, how it works in mind, but start small. So usually, well, if you need certain pieces of data from a business partner that you know, or from a customer that you have trustful relationships with, start with those. But let's say have in mind the overall principles for this data space architecture so that it's future-proof, so that you can evolve your use cases along, let's say, this overall principles. But definitely start small in order to get going, to create trust in this small environment, and also to learn, to be honest. Yeah. And the other thing is also, which we should not forget, make sure that you have made your homework. So have your internal data management in order, because otherwise you will every single use case over and over again be drowning in effort. Where does the data come from internally? Ooh, we have like 20 databases for customer data. Don't know what the right one is and whether the quality. If you do not have a proper data management in place, really do that first, or do that at least in parallel before you engage in data sharing activities.
Yeah, also good because we're heading to spring, right? So spring cleaning and housekeeping for the internal data management. Yeah, maybe a good next step.
It's a good time in the year to do that. That's true. Open up your windows and let the wind blow through your data management. Very good.
So basically time is over. Thanks again, Boris, for the keynote. There is another question available. Martin, I saw that. As we said before, we will collect these kind of questions and answer them afterwards, so that everyone at least gets the information and your opinion on this kind of questions, Boris. Thanks again. We will see you later.